Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now lecture number 2 in our look at Chapter 9, looking at the topic of leadership. And as we start out this dive into the topic of leadership, one of the first things we want to describe is, well, as we talked about in the first lecture, what is leadership? If leadership is about motivating and uniting and compelling people, human resources in the organization to accomplish organizational goals, well, then how do leaders accomplish this? What do leaders use in order to accomplish this, to be able to mobilize human resources towards achieving organizational goals? And the answer is power. Leaders use power to influence, motivate, and mobilize human resources, people in the organization. We use power. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad or an evil thing, not intrinsically so. What is power? Power is the ability to affect the behavior of others. Again, some leaders have great power. And the general rule of power is what? With great power comes great responsibility. Power itself is not moral. It has no moral component. An ethical and moral component comes from the hands of the person wielding the power. So let's take a closer look at various forms of power used in social organizations. You can see here that, generally speaking, behavioral psychologists and organizational psychologists for decades now have recognized 5 general forms of social power that leaders use to mobilize and inspire and to affect the behavior of followers. You see them listed here: legitimate power, reward power, coercive power, reference power, and expert power. Now, we have thought about this for a long time, and the academic research really does bear out. These are the 5 general forms of social power to be aware of. And quite frankly, in your life, you should look to this description. You should examine the uses of leader power that you see in the world around you and in your own environment, and consider, as you see these things happen, which is the form of power, the dominant form of power being used. You'll generally see examples of these 5 types of social power all around you. Now let's take a closer look at it then. Legitimate power. We define that as power granted through the organizational hierarchy. And perhaps the easiest way to understand that is when your boss instructs you to do something, you might be tempted to respond, sort of like Malcolm in the Middle. You're not the boss of me now, except for the fact that he actually has a business card that officially says he is the boss of you now. And the reason why you are working there is because he has the power to tell you what to do. And in that case, that's pretty easy to understand. That is simply a use of legitimate power. Compare that then to reward power, the power to give or withhold rewards. And this, of course, is, even as you see the illustration here, right? Dude in a suit being motivated, being led by a carrot on a stick, right? Is that we are motivated, people are motivated by rewards that are placed in front of them, right? If you reach this performance target, you will get a bonus. If you reach this level of sales revenue, you get an extra 10% in your commission, etc., etc. And there are, of course, many, many different forms of rewards. They don't have to be financial. There can be other forms of rewards as well. But this is certainly a use of power, the ability to have say-so power over potential rewards, and thereby to use them to motivate certain people. The third form of leadership power, coercive power, the power to force compliance by means of psychological, emotional, or physical threat. Now, of course, you look at that term coercive power and you see the description, and so, you know, the photo of Darth Vader I found is an obvious visual example of coercive power, right? You will do as I say. I'm sorry, that's just an awful Darth Vader impression, but you get the point, right? However, you should know that in organizations, coercive power is not always a black, evil, dark side of the force, Darth Vader kind of a thing, right? Because, quite frankly, coercive power is also the root of a warning like, you will not sexually harass your coworkers, or you will not only be fired, you might be brought up on charges by the police. Now, if you think about it, what form of power is that? That's a warning. That's a warning that if you do something, bad things will happen to you, and that is a form of coercion, a very right and just use of coercive power. So you can see there, again, as I've said at the very beginning, with great power comes great responsibility. Use even coercive power, use it well and for right ends, and it's a legitimate use of that form of leadership power. The fourth form of leadership power, referent power, power based on identification, imitation, loyalty, or charisma. And the example here, I've given you the photo, of course, of Michael Jordan drumming up donations for a particular charity in his local area, simply because he's Michael Jordan. And so people will come to hear him speak at a big donation drive simply by who he is, the power based on identification. And if MJ says possibly the greatest basketball player of all time, if he says, I want you to give a donation to this very worthy charity, you may be compelled to do that, or you may be mobilized to do that simply because, well, I saw Michael Jordan, he asked me to do it, right? That's all based on referent power. All right, so now we look at the last form, the fifth form of social power, and that is expert power. And you see there the picture of Albert Einstein teaching a class on math and physics. If you're going to have someone teach you on math and physics, yeah, I'd probably choose taking it from Einstein rather than anyone else. And there, of course, is a perfect example of a recognized expert in the field. For my money, still the greatest physicist who ever lived. And yes, I am aware of Stephen Hawking and some of the others, but for my money, I still think it's Albert Einstein. And again, there's the power that comes from being a recognized expert in the field. However, realize it isn't just simply being the world's best or the world's recognized expert. Expert power derives from well-documented information or expertise. And so that's really becomes sort of the whole point of expert power. You don't have to aspire to become an expert, but simply if you have command of the information and the data, you wield expert power to be able to influence the behavior of others. Now, if we put this all together, we see here on one slide the 5 forms of social power. Legitimate power, power which is granted through the organizational hierarchy. Reward power, the power to give or withhold rewards. Coercive power, the power to force compliance by means of psychological, emotional, or physical threat. Reference power, power based on identification, imitation, loyalty, or charisma. And finally, expert power, power derived from information or expertise. And again, these are 5 forms of social power which are wielded by leaders to affect the behavior of others. So let me just give a quick example. Let me ask you a question. Let's say that a few years after you graduate from college, you find yourself in a leadership role, leading a work team where the average age of the person on the work team you're leading is twice your age. And you're the new kid on the block. They've worked for the company for maybe a decade longer than you have. They're more experienced. They have more tenure. How will you lead them? Why will they listen to you as you attempt to affect and influence their behavior? That's a question I want to ask you. When you look at this, the 5 forms of social power, which form of power would you typically use? And the answer to that question, quite frankly, is expert power. Let me see if I can explain that. If you're the new hot young kid on the block, right? You've got a college degree, but everyone's older there that you're leading, and that they've all had more years at the company, you're only going to get so far trying to use legitimate power. I want you to do this because I'm your boss. Okay? And then, in fact, that's the whole problem. That's the challenge, right? They know you're the boss. They know you were hired to be their boss, but they know more than you. Okay, reward power. Well, quite frankly, you only have a certain budget. You can't triple, quadruple benefits and reward packages and bonuses. So there's only going to go so far that you can use reward power, and you would reserve that for very special uses. Coercive power seldom works. People aren't going to listen to you simply because you threaten to fire them if they don't, or write them up and put them on a performance plan or something like that. You have no identification, loyalty, or charisma, so referent power isn't really applicable here. What I would tell you is you would want to use rational persuasion with these older workers, and that means rational persuasion based on information. You want to win them to your side. You want them to know that you value their opinion, and you want to wield the information you have as a leader in that group to be able to appeal rationally to their sense of being with the organization to mobilize them in the same direction. Now, I hope that makes sense. In fact, we'll probably provide a discussion forum for us to interact with that very question. If you're a young leader, how do you lead older employees? Again, you are going to be using one of the forms, or perhaps more than one of the forms of the 5 forms of social power. But these are things that we use in the real world to help to affect and influence the behavior of others. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next lecture.